Law. This book is called The Common Law Community Training Manual, Establishing the Reign of Natural Liberty, the Common Law and its Courts. A community training manual issued by the International Tribunal into Crimes of Church and State, Brussels. What is assembling is the first court in history to bring judgment against the Vatican and the Crown of England as institutions. But our court also signals the dawn of a new notion of justice, one defined by the people themselves, and especially by the historic victims of church and state, to bring about not only a judgment on their persecutors, but a new political and spiritual arrangement to undo the systems responsible for intergenerational crimes against humanity. This is from the founding charter of the International Common Law Court of Justice, September the 1st, 2012. Introduction. History was made on February the 11th, 2013, when the first Catholic Pope in history resigned from his office during peacetime in order to avoid arrest for protecting and aiding child raping priests. Barely 2 weeks later, the same Pope, Benedict Joseph Ratzinger, was found guilty by the International Common Law Court of Justice for crimes against humanity, including child trafficking. And the arrest warrant that he had anticipated and which provoked his resignation was issued against him on February the 25th, 2013. Evading justice inside the Vatican, Ratzinger is presently an international fugitive from the law and a living example of the power of common law courts to successfully prosecute so-called heads of state. The lawful verdict of the International Common Law Court of Justice was a shot heard around the world that has spawned efforts in 21 countries to establish similar popular courts of justice to reclaim the law from the wealthy and their compliant governments. See www.itccs.org. This manual provides instruction and training to those of you who have moved from words to actions. We speak to those who not only recognise the permanent war being waged against humanity by a global corporate tyranny, but who are actively engaged in dismantling the murderous system at its source, so that justice can be made real in a reclaimed world. You are part of a growing movement to create a new liberated society within the shell of the old, by first allowing the law to act for all people and not a clique of judicial specialists and their friends. That new society is emerging through every act of courage and integrity by we who know what is at stake, and that is our children and the future of our species. Why we are taking action, freeing ourselves by remembering the true law. In inverted commas, man is born free, yet everywhere he is in chains. That fact has altered little over the centuries. But the chains of oppression over much of our species have been forged through the weapons of violence and ignorance, and they can be undone. Long before any rulers held sway over humanity, men and women established customs and laws among themselves to ensure their peace and liberties are free as free self-governing people. They did so from an inherent recognition of natural law, capital N, capital L, of equality, or divine law, whereby no one has any right to dominate or rule over others, or to seize more of creation than another, or to own any part of the world given equally to all people. It is the divine principle of creation that every child is born is endowed with unalienable liberties that no authority, law, government, or religion can diminish or abolish. Any power that attempts to do so is tyrannical and illegitimate, even if it operates according to its own laws. For such tyranny is a denial of the natural order and an attack upon divinity and humanity. Two great principles summarise this natural law. Number one, all things exist and are held in common. By the state of nature, no one has any more of a claim to the earth than another, as noted by founder of modern law Thomas Hobbes. I demonstrate in the first place that in the natural state of men, which state we may properly call the state of nature, all men have equal rights unto all things. 1651. Number 2, the law does no harm to no one. Beg your pardon. The law does harm to no one. Arising from the Ten Commandments and God's law to do no harm to one's neighbour, this principle forms the basis of modern law. John Stuart Mill articulated this principle in On Liberty, where he argued that the only purpose for which power can be rightfully exercised over any member of a civilized community against his will is to prevent harm to others. An equivalent idea was earlier stated in France's Declaration of the Rights of Man and of the Citizen of 1789 as liberty consists in the freedom to do everything which injures no one else. Hence, the exercise of the natural rights of each man has no limits except those which assure to the other members of the society the enjoyment of the same rights. These limits can only be determined by law. This natural law exists to maintain the natural peace and equity between people, and is their shield and protector against unjust rule, rather than a force over them. Within the ancient traditions of tribal communities, especially in the Anglo-Saxon world, this law evolved into what became known as the customary or common law, or the law of the land, a phrase that's been borrowed and perhaps bastardized. It has strong echoes in the customs of indigenous nations all over the world. Here is a basic summary of the nature of true or common law versus arbitrary law. Okay, so before we get into these 10 points, just a little summary that the guy who's put this book together is a man called Kevin Annett from Canada. And Kevin Annett was a vicar with the church in Canada who was moved to parishes whereby he was uncovering eventually atrocities. So it began with financial corruption and irregularities and infringements, but as he continued investigating, he found that the Crown, the Church and the State were all complicit and involved in atrocities of particularly native Canadians over decades, spanning almost 100 years, and huge numbers. Tens of thousands of Canadian children were murdered in what's rightfully known as a genocide. And in his naivety, he blew the whistle, raised the alarm, wrote letters, expected people to be as up in arms about these crimes as he was, and found that in fact he was to be persecuted for his knowledge, for what he knew. And so within a very short space of time he was robbed of his children through corrupt family law, robbed of his livelihood and his home, and he was persecuted by mental health departments. Basically, many agencies of the state came together to silence him as best as they could, and particularly his allies with regards to Canadian witnesses. A lot of them were not only silenced but have never been seen since. And so Kevin Annett has put together this book, fairly succinct, it's not quite 60 pages, explaining the differences between common law and the law that's currently profligated in Western societies, which is an evolved version of Roman canon law. And it's, as I'm sure everybody's very well aware, justices bought the most wealthy and powerful people are able to manipulate the law to their own best interests. If you look at the pyramids of hierarchies of power with regards to global society, you'll see that government is fairly low down, and judiciaries protect those at the very top of the pyramid with corrupt laws. The laws are very much to maintain the status quo and to shield some international criminals of enormous power and influence from justice.